Afternoon, everyone. This final video recording covers content from week 9 related to muted group theory, as well as week 10 covering feminist standpoint theory and co-cultural theory. Your final assignments for the course are the weeks 9 and 10 quiz that covers those three theories, as well as completing the final research paper, which is a revision of one of your two application papers from the course. Let's go ahead and dive in. First of all, note that the extra credit is also due on June 11th. This is asking you to pick one of the theories that we haven't had the chance to talk about over the quarter and doing a bit of an analysis about that. And then make sure that you have caught up in any remaining material because grades will need to be submitted on June 11th. This week, we'll be looking at muted group theory, feminist standpoint theory, and lastly, co-cultural theory. Three theories that are more critically oriented and all very closely connected to one another. Let's get started on muted group theory. This is a theory that is examining the ways that language has power and ability to serve dominant groups that create that language and those that belong to similar groups. So for example, the development of English as a language meant that many indigenous populations who did not necessarily initially speak English were often left out of the policy and related issues that came about due to control over language. People from other groups are oftentimes seen as less articulate or ridiculed for not following the language of that dominant group. It takes a semiotic, critical, and cultural approach. There was a stage production a few years ago called All in a Row that was depicting a family, including an autistic child. However, the stage production drew an immense amount of criticism because rather than play the autistic child with an actor, it was played by a puppet. And many in the disability community were critical of this depiction because it was seen as making that character not a full person played by an actor. As an example of muted group theory of literally making a person into a puppet or not fully an agent who had the ability to speak or emote or express who they are. So this theory comes from Sheris Carmamine, who is a scholar of women's studies and communication. And this theory is very closely connected to the ways in which gender impacts our understanding of historical marginalization. There are a few assumptions from this theory. One of them being that women perceive the world differently than men because of women's and men's distribution and labor. The idea that historically women have not had the same types of opportunities to career growth that men have, even though there have been a number of changes in a contemporary way, is an important idea here. Because of political dominance, men's systems of expression is dominant and has impacted alternative modes of expression among women. That is, we think about a lot of the ways that historically representation and leadership has been a boys' club, and that type of leadership has impacted women's ability to participate and communicate. And that in order to participate, women must often transform their own models of communication into a more masculine mode of expression. This is especially when we consider large positions of power. CEOs of large companies, for instance, are predominantly male, and that means that more masculine communication styles tend to be valued more highly in those types of roles. One of the key ideas from Gaetari Spivak, who's a scholar in cultural studies, is this notion of can the subaltern speak? That is, can a population who experiences marginalization have the ability to address or speak out against the marginalization that they encounter? And that ties closely to a few key ideas here. One of them being the notion of a power base, that people who have created a language essentially have the most ability to express and understand it. You have power over a language as a result of being the person who speaks it as a first language. Dominant and non-dominant groups refer to those who created the language versus those who participate within it. For example, being an international student or traveling to a foreign country oftentimes means that you are ceding to the dominant group's language. And then lastly, there's this notion of gender polarization, that genders express themselves in increasingly different and unique ways that impact the overall communication process. When it comes to tactics, this theory suggests that one of the tactics that emerges is known as ridicule, or making fun or teasing other people. This is evident in a variety of cases in which the use of gendered language, stereotypes, catcalling, and similar practices might make fun of or insult individuals. A ritual pattern, right? A pattern of behavior such as over and over asking a woman in a group to be the one to take notes can be a way that women at times experience silencing. Control, or directly regulating and saying that somebody does not get a raise or does not get a promotion on the basis of gender, while not necessarily legal, can still be utilized in somewhat more covert ways as a method of control. And harassment, the repeated unwanted targeting, for example, using sexist language or making jokes or comments that are hurtful towards somebody is an example of silencing at play. And this theory also suggests that there's ways to combat silencing. One of them is to reclaim or use the language or insults in a more positive way. For example, the word queer was previously used as an insult to target members of LGBTQ+ community, but has been reclaimed by members of that community in a more positive way. Elevating might involve supporting and affirming the perspectives of other people, lifting everybody up. And then celebrating involves recognizing and supporting diversity and difference, including diversity in terms of gender in participation. This critique has this theory has a few critiques. One of them is a notion of essentialism, that boiling down or essentializing just to gender might ignore a lot of the other differences that we encounter. Another being the test of time, with some of the changes in demographics and the way that we have noticed changes on the basis of gender. And also the idea that sometimes people engage in the dominant language of a society, and that the strategies that people use to engage and participate within that language aren't necessarily considered or incorporated as fully. As mentioned, All in a Row was a stage production in which the portrayal of an autistic child as a puppet drew a lot of criticism for essentially skewing someone out of language, participation, and expression entirely. Secondarily, we have this idea of feminist standpoint theory. This is a theory that is important to recognize in the idea that feminism is not singular. There are multiple feminisms, both in terms of waves and in terms of the assumptions, perspectives, and views that feminism might have. Feminist standpoint theory argues that women are situated, again, similarly to muted group, in unique social locations based on their membership in groups as it relates to gender, but also as it relates to other aspects of identity, such as race and so on. And that as a result of these unique social locations, women oftentimes experience social situations from vantage points or standpoints that are formed in opposition to dominant power, again, recognizing this sort of historically masculine role of power. And that by resisting that power, a standpoint develops. A standpoint is knowledge from a particular location. It doesn't mean that somebody views the entire situation, but instead a part of the overall social hierarchy or way of looking at the world. So let's break things down a little bit. Feminist standpoint theory assumes what's known as material life, right? Material, dealing with the tangible physical items that we have, access to food, water, money, shelter, and so on. The material life or class position that we occupy structures and informs how we understand social relationships. If somebody comes from a really wealthy perspective, they wouldn't necessarily know the measures to save up or make ends meet that are experienced by somebody who's living paycheck to paycheck. The material life might be structured in an oppositional way for different groups. As a result, if somebody historically has greater access to financial resources, this dominant group has the ability to have a lot of control and influence over others. That the visions of the ruling group structure the material relations in which all group members participate suggests that that power impacts the overall social structure. And that lastly, that struggle and an achievement happens through a group that might experience oppression, resisting or speaking out against the oppression that they might be encountering. As mentioned, there's not a single feminism, but the broad notion of feminism is generally focused on the social positioning and experiences of women, including trans and non-binary perspectives, and discrimination on the basis of sex and gender identity. And feminisms can be understood in the context of waves. The first wave in the United States was generally very focused on suffrage. The right to vote was seen as a crucial tool for political participation. Secondarily, there was a greater focus on women's liberation. This was especially true in the 1980s, where there was a focus on expanded access to opportunities in the workplace, especially true in terms of, as we see happening again, discussions surrounding abortion, reproduction-related issues and topics, and healthcare. And then many consider us to be in the third wave, in which there's a greater focus on international perspectives and on this idea of intersectionality. Pictured here is Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a law professor who developed the idea of intersectionality to specifically focus on the ways in which Black women encountered barriers in the legal system that were unique from white men or that were unique from white men, Black men, Black and so forth, right? That the focus on Black women was especially unique in identifying and articulating struggles related to gender. Under standpoint theory, it's this idea that a standpoint views imbalances and a unique perspective to the world. If you've ever heard of the story of the scientists and the elephant, it's the idea that there's an elephant in a dark cave, and a bunch of scientists go in and are asked to identify what's in the cave. And based on the location in the cave that they found themselves in, they either thought that it was a spear, a fan, a snake, a rope, and so on, and they only got part of the overall elephant. So that idea of getting part of the story is this notion of the standpoint. Oftentimes, these standpoints are designed to help us learn and engage in a more just world. In addition to this idea of a standpoint, there's the notion of a voice, of speaking out and addressing marginalization that's encountered. Donna Haraway, pictured on the right, is a scholar who put together the idea of situated knowledge, that we have unique information that we gain as a result of our social location and position to the world. And also this idea of sexual division of labor, that historically, on the basis of sex, a lot of labor in the United States has found itself deeply divided. So feminist standpoint theory does have a few critiques. Again, this idea of essentialism comes up, including gender essentialism, that there are a lot of elements in addition to gender, and that gender is not a single element that shapes difference. Another critique is this idea of dualisms or extremes, that perhaps this theory views differences in gender as too significant. This idea of these critiques and extremes plays a really big role here. And then the other critique is that other aspects of identity may be particularly important in addition to gender. Again, the third wave and a focus on intersectionality has more closely been trying to engage in these questions. Carrie Nation was an interesting example and way of thinking about doing feminist standpoint theory. If you're familiar, in the 1980s or in the 1800s up to the turn of the century and early 1900s, there was a focus on prohibition. But one thing that's not been talked about as much with prohibition has been the impact that alcohol consumption at the time had on women. In fact, Carrie Nation was motivated because her husband was an alcoholic and died from alcohol poisoning. And she felt that Alcohol consumption by men in particular led to disproportionate gender impacts, whether it be sort of risk to one's life, or also intoxication leading to greater risk of abuse. As a result, while we think about prohibition oftentimes in terms of a strategy that was failed, that was unsuccessful, one thing we don't think about as much in prohibition is why many women, like Carrie, advocated for it at the time due to the gendered impacts that alcohol consumption had. Carrie was known for carrying a hatchet and literally going to bars and destroying all the containers of alcohol that she could find. And it's an interesting example of using this theory to understand the standpoint and situated knowledge that Carrie had that lets us think about a new perspective on this issue. Prohibition, of course, doesn't work, as we found at the time, but its advocates were doing so from a variety of perspectives, such as this one. The final theory to talk about is co-cultural theory, or CCT, which helps to understand how individuals from marginalized groups choose to engage with and respond with the dominant group, and how those strategies of communication can be mapped and explored. Again, it's a critical cultural approach, and I think that looking at the disability rights movement in the United States is a good way to explore this. This theory comes from Mark Orby from the University of Georgia. Co-cultural theory assumes that when a culture is organized in a hierarchy, when there is leadership and structure, that certain groups have power and influence over others, again, closely tied to muted group and feminist standpoint. The lived experiences of underrepresented groups, of individuals who are marginalized or members of co-cultures, are valuable and things that we should better understand and engage with. And that the members of these smaller and underrepresented groups might have differing ideas, views, and perspectives, but they share an outsider view of that dominant larger culture. Another key idea here, again, going back to co-cultures, it's a group that is smaller or outside of the dominant social structure. Is again the idea of intersectionality, of overlapping elements of identity, and then this idea of phenomenology. That means that people are active participants, they're involved, and phenomenology is very concerned with how our own experience shapes our understanding of the world. That being a co-researcher means understanding how the participants and people that we study and work with in our work closely connect to who we are. So this theory creates a 3x3 grid that essentially describes the different communication approaches that people can take to address experiences of marginalization as part of a dominant society. On the one end, at the top, we have assimilation, which refers to fully incorporating or becoming a member of that dominant group and ceding your smaller cultural identity. Accommodation, which is sort of in between, it involves acclimating to elements of that culture, but still keeping your own unique elements of your own co-culture, or separating and completely removing yourself from that larger culture group. These also range from non-assertive to aggressive, non-assertive being a very passive and unengaged style, assertive being somewhat advocacy focused, and aggressive being very direct, even to the detriment of others. And this 3x3 grid then means that the approaches that people use to respond to a dominant culture or group might look very different depending on the individual and resources that they have available. This theory also suggests that people use a variety of different communication strategies in order to engage with and understand the perspectives that are available to them. One of them being field of experience. The personal experience and history might shape their approach to a strategy or issue. For example, a lot of prominent disability advocates involved in organizations that go several decades back, such as ADAPT, are able to recognize that certain strategies like occupying street buildings have been able to successfully create political change, drawing from a field of experience. A perceived cost and rewards might involve assessing the benefits and costs of engaging in a larger culture versus separation, the benefits of an assimilation approach or more aggressive approach, and so on. Capability refers to the ability of individuals to accomplish the particular tasks that they set out to do, whether they're trying to incorporate elements of their own culture into a dominant culture or to separate out and really make their own culture stand away. And situations include factors such as people present and the amount of support you might have from a particular group that could impact whether you choose a more assertive, aggressive, or assimilative approach. This theory has gained some critique, one of them being that dominant group members aren't fully considered in terms of their behavior in the group, that we need to look at how dominant group members behave or act more specifically. Another critique is the idea that some factors, such as nationality, aren't fully included in the theory. So for instance, in analyzing co-culture, we need to think about how a lot of different elements shape and make these cultures. And then lastly, there's a critique of parsimony, that the theory might be too essentializing in describing identities such as race. Either you're a member of the dominant culture or the co-culture. And in reality, there are a lot more complex elements that help to shape and impact culture overall. By the way, my cat has decided to jump up and say hello. This is Miles. So as a way of understanding and applying this, the disability rights movement in the United States is a really interesting example. In 1990, we saw passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which ensures reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability. However, the tactics and strategies that people with disabilities used as a co-culture were wildly varied. Some of them were very aggressive, such as occupying and literally blocking traffic on the streets, which could be seen as a more aggressive and perhaps more separation-oriented approach, while other strategies were more assimilative, such as encouraging participation of integration of people with disabilities into schools. So we can think about how the specific decisions and strategies that members of co-cultures use are based on the situation and goals that those group members have. So to wrap up the three theories that we've talked about for this week, we talked about muted group theory and about how members of dominant groups oftentimes exclude people from communication and participation. We talked about feminist standpoint theory and the ways that social location and positionality shape our communication. And lastly, we looked at co-cultural theory, which looks at how smaller groups respond to and address the communication of larger, more dominant groups. Again, taken together, these three theories are closely connected by examining the ways that dominant groups participate and about how people respond to the communication of these larger dominant groups. Thank you for a great quarter. Best of luck as you're wrapping up the remaining assignments, the quiz, and the final research paper. The rubric and guidelines for that assignment are available on Canvas, and I'm happy to help as you're working through that assignment or would like feedback on a rough draft or outline. Have a great rest of your quarter and have an excellent summer.